Thank you so much to the organizers for putting together such a wonderful event and for the honor to speak with you today. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a program of research that I started with my students and my postdocs probably 5 or 6 years ago. So for people earlier on in their career or shortly after getting a faculty position, you can trek out and study entirely new things. It's possible to do that. And you can get tenure. It's a thing. So what I want to talk to you about today is the evolution and ontogeny of ritual. So rituals are universal features of human culture. The diversity of ritual practice is astonishing and ranges from elaborate religious ceremonies to initiation rites to simple greetings. So in my research, I'm seeking to understand how ritual evolved, certainly not a small question, to identify the adaptive functions of ritual, and to examine how it develops over ontogeny. My core training is in cognitive and developmental psychology, so I'm especially interested in how young children become competent cultural animals. And understanding the rituals and conventions of your group is a big part of being culturally competent. So ritual is among the most distinctive features of human behavior, and I would argue if you're looking for a candidate for human uniqueness, and let's face it, when are we not? Ritual is a really great place to look. And despite how pervasive ritual is, until recently, there's been very little scientific attention directed to understanding and explaining the psychological foundations of ritual. I think for some of the same reasons that religion was largely neglected by psychology, ritual was neglected for the same reason. Unfortunately, our disciplines are very siloed, and we have pushed ritual and religion off into the domain of anthropology, which it should be as much of a focus for psychological inquiry as anthropological inquiry. So I hope by the end of this talk to persuade you that ritual serves very powerful functions in human cognition and culture and should be a focal topic of interdisciplinary scientific inquiry, in case you're not already persuaded. So consider Brazilian simpachias. Now, simpachias are remedial procedures or recipes. I think of them as ritualistic remedies, in fact, and they're widely used to solve all manner of everyday problems. In fact, if you have a problem of any kind, there's definitely a sympachia for you. So the range of problems that sympachias are used to treat, it ranges from asthma to infidelity, lots of love sympachias, mating problem sympachias, to unemployment. So take the case of this particular sympachia. Now keep in mind, these are used to solve problems. So people think they could potentially work, right? They put time and effort into doing them. So they're at least entertaining the possibility that that might work. See if you can figure out how people might assume this would have a causal effect. This one is for attracting a partner. So buy a new sharp knife and stick it 4 times into a banana tree on June 12th at midnight. Catch the liquid that will drip from the plant's wound on a crisp white paper. It has been folded in 2. The dripping liquid captured on the paper will form the letter of the name of your future partner. So I think this is fascinating for a number of reasons, primarily because, it's interesting that rational actors, which humans are occasionally, I've heard, have evolved elaborate and sophisticated cause and effect reasoning. So we know that humans are relatively sophisticated when it comes to physical causal reasoning. And yet frequently engage in behavior like this that is, I think you would probably agree, pretty vacuous from at least a causal mechanistic perspective. So if you can't figure out why people think this works, and again, I've already established that people do think these rituals have the potential to work, you're in good company. So for decades, anthropologists have asked people who engage in rituals like these how they work, and people don't know. Or if they do, they engage in some kind of post hoc rationalization, and every one of your participants tells you this works in a different way. To give you a little clue as to how people think these might work, not that they have necessarily a conscious understanding, but implicitly, this procedural detail, the very high level of procedural detail, is not a coincidence. And of course, neither is the use of rituals for fitness-relevant events like mating. So the point is that rituals often have instrumental goals. But rituals also have important social functions. So consider the extraordinarily complex ritual cycle of pig slaughter of the Zambaga of New Guinea, which Roy Rappaport describes. The Zambaga ritual cycle centers around periodic warfare, again, fitness-relevant event, and this warfare occurs between groups who compete over resources and retaliate over transgressions. Now, the timing of the warfare is closely related to the size and the spread of the pig herds. Alliances with other neighboring groups, usually through extended kin networks, are formed to aid in battle. Now, there are a number of rituals that are performed prior to the beginning of the warfare, specifically to inform the ancestors of the intention to fight. So in reading this ethnographic account, which if you haven't read Pigs and Ancestors, please do yourself a favor, it's really fascinating. The best ethnography is immensely psychologically insightful. But when I read this account, I was struck by how costly, in terms of time and effort and resources, these behaviors often are. So I'll talk more about the role of collective rituals like these, and the role they might play in solving the adaptive problems of group living. So what is ritual? There are many, many books in anthropology dedicated to understanding ritual. My perspective is to bring a kind of fresh cognitive psychological lens on trying to understand ritual. So in the examples that I gave you previously, you can tell rituals vary enormously. You've got these ritualistic remedies used in Brazil to solve problems of mating. You have these large-scale collective rituals, which I just previously described, that are oriented towards coordinating group behavior. So they're used on the individual level. In some cases, they're used collectively. There's enormous variation. What I want to propose is underlying similarities that I think unite, at least unite them psychologically, of all these diverse behaviors. I think two characteristics of ritual are critical. One is the social stipulation. So rituals are the result of an agreement to participate in a socially determined convention, right? So rituals are ultimately group conventions, and thus they're not the product of individual innovation. So this distinguishes ritual from habit or routine. Now keep in mind, many people pull from ritual practices within their communities to inform the kinds of personal habits they have. It's not a coincidence that hopefully all of us have toothbrushing habits and routines, but those vary dramatically at the level of the individual. So I'm making a distinction between that and collective ritual, which I think is enormously consequential if we want to understand high fidelity cultural transmission, which is also part of the ritual story, and I'll talk about that next. But as I mentioned earlier in the case of Simbachias, rituals are causally opaque, and by that I'm referring to physical causality. I'm not suggesting that people don't have any sense of the efficacy of ritual, because they definitely do. But the mechanism, at least the physical causal mechanism, is always absent. So even when rituals are used in the context of achieving a certain outcome, which they often are, so for example, dancing in synchrony and producing rainfall, there's often not an expectation of a transparent or even potentially knowable causal mechanism linking ritual action and outcome. So critically, my argument here is not that rituals lack a causal mechanism on the level of the individual. They're vacuous from the perspective of physical causality. So as I mentioned before in the case of the ethnographic account of the Zambaga, rituals serve important social functions. So they're not just used to solve instrumental problems. Not that those are mutually exclusive. Often there's a combination of achieving or solving an instrumental problem as well as serving a social function. Rituals drive cultural transmission intergenerationally. Right? So it's not an accident that you can go to a Catholic Mass in any country in the world and listen to Mass in one of hundreds of different languages. And if you've been raised Catholic, you still know when to kneel. You know the details of the ceremony. So that level of high fidelity transmission and the preservation of group level behaviors and identity over time is a critical part of understanding the psychology of ritual and explaining why we have these bizarre behaviors in the first place. I think rituals provide key insight into the evolution and ontogeny of group cognition and behavior. I'm going to talk quite a bit about experimental evidence for this later in my talk. and are ultimately the product of both cognitive and cultural evolution in humans. So the objective of my work is to try to contribute to an integrative account of ritual cognition and behavior by answering Tinbergen's 4 questions, which is always a worthwhile endeavor. So I'll begin by discussing ultimate questions about the phylogeny of ritual, which is a fairly new topic, but extremely exciting. There was actually just a blog on NPR about this morning. And I'll discuss my theoretical and empirical work on the adaptive value of ritual. And I'll end by discussing how my research examines questions that are more proximate about the mechanism and ontogeny of ritual. And I've done quite a lot of empirical work on this latter topic. So let's start with the phylogeny of ritual. Now, beliefs that associate cause and effect where none exists have very ancient evolutionary roots. So consider the captive chimp colony located near an airport. One day, a giant mechanical bird, the apex of the cultural evolution of another primate species, in fact, is spotted overhead, and the alpha male chimp rushes out to engage in aggressive displays, and the mechanical bird, lo and behold, flies away. Imagine that. So the next time it happens, the chimp repeats the same aggressive displays, and this mechanical bird, this plane, disappears. So sure enough, this happens every single time. So keep in mind, in the brain of the chimp, this is clear evidence of a causal association between action and outcome. Right? This works 100% of the time. Now, overestimating the association between cause and effect is adaptive, or can be adaptive. Evolution should favor mechanisms that identify noise signals as a threat, even when the chance of a threat is very remote. So natural selection can favor strategies that lead to frequent errors in assessment, as long as the occasional correct response carries a large fitness benefit. So do other animals engage in ritual? Right, if you look at birds, for example, there's tons of evidence of behavior that looks ritualistic anyway. It looks superstitious, it looks very stereotyped. There have been some recent claims about potentially ritualistic rock throwing in chimps. I don't know if you saw the evidence of this recently, and it's quite interesting. Very rich interpretations associated with this behavior. So I think while it's important not to over-attribute human thinking to other animals, the evolutionary roots of ritual run deep, or likely run deep, and are shared in part with other animals, and I think other primates in particular. But again, this is a topic of quite extensive research. And just briefly, if you're not familiar with this particular study, there's evidence of both male and female, but primarily male chimps, throwing stones at trees, and also collecting stones inside trees, as you can see right there. This isn't associated with foraging or with food of any sort. And one possibility is that this might be some evidence of kind of proto-spiritual or religious or sacred behavior. Probably very unlikely. It's possible it's just really fun to throw those rocks. Clearly, this could be an aggressive display. It could also make a lot of noise that might travel to other chimps. Anyway, the point is there's some really interesting, provocative research going on here. Now, as I mentioned before, erring on the side of caution is a survival strategy, even if it leads to seemingly irrational beliefs and behaviors. Humans are certainly not the only animals to engage in this. So rituals could be a byproduct of the hazard precaution system. Pascal Boyer has done really, I think, fascinating work on this topic. And it's about detecting and reacting to inferred threats to fitness. So dangers in our evolutionary past, reproductive risk, predation, contamination, resource scarcity, social harm, are all part of the story. It's, of course, no coincidence that so much of ritual is directly involved with those dangers in our evolutionary past. So rituals might be a behavioral response to reduce uncertainty. There's actually a good bit of experimental evidence for this now, and attempt to avoid negative outcomes. So loss in battle, for example, as well as, of course, increasing the likelihood, or at least the perception of the likelihood, for some kind of a positive outcome, such as mating opportunities. So one of the things that we did in the research on Simpichias that are widely used in Brazil is to look at the portion of sympachias that are used for mating-related problems. And my colleague David Buss was very unsurprised to hear that about 75% of the sympachias had something to do with mating. Very frequently, women use them to attempt to reduce infidelity of their partners, probably not with a lot of success. So one example of the relationship between ritual and uncertainty comes again from ethnography. So Malinowski described this among the Trobriand islanders in a very classic ethnographic work. We know that ritual is common in activities surrounding ocean sea fishing expeditions. So Malinowski documented this, but there's much broader evidence for this now. So rituals are much more common when the ocean conditions are dangerous and risky, and success is subject to enormous variation. Much more ritualistic behavior there. It's largely absent when the seas are calm or when men are fishing in lagoons. I do a lot of my field work in Tanah Vanuatu, which is in Melanesia. This is a very subsistence agricultural population, but they do an extensive amount of fishing. And sure enough, many of the rituals in that context are associated with achieving positive outcomes. And at least there's a bit of evidence that we've collected that the more uncertain the sea and the conditions are, the more ritual exists. So let's turn now to the adaptive value of ritual. So living in large groups, as you all know, introduces adaptive problems. You need to coordinate group members for collective action. You need to minimize free riders. You need to increase group commitment to joint goals. You need to prevent defection to rival groups. And ritual may be, in part, a solution to problems of group living. So ritual has a great variety of social functions. The evolutionary anthropological literature on this topic is rich and really fascinating. And we've, my postdoc, Rachel Watson-Jones, and I recently have reviewed both the anthropological literature on this topic as well as the newer psychological literature on this topic, and published this paper in Current Directions in Psychological Science, if you're interested in more detail. So rituals do a lot of useful things when it comes to social functions. They mark members of in-groups. So they provide reliable markers of who belongs in a group and who does not. Rituals often mark group members in practically and psychologically very, very powerful ways and serve as an indication of one's behavioral type. This facilitates affiliation, especially if you're interacting with a lot of people that you are unfamiliar with. Right? If you've got markers that you are part of a particular group, ritualistic markers, this would signal that you are potentially a good prospect for cooperative interactions. Rituals also include seemingly, and not seemingly, actually, very costly actions that operate as reliable signals that convey an individual's commitment to the group. So rituals are very salient evidence of behavioral commitment to groups. A lot of the rituals that are associated with fitness-relevant events, or for example, initiation rites, are extremely costly. They are costly in terms of time, they're often painful, and they're hard to fake signals of commitment to a group. It's hard to explain why you would agree to let someone put a metal rod through your cheeks if you weren't deeply committed to the ideals of a particular group. There's also growing evidence that through signaling group commitment, rituals may contribute to cooperative behavior with in-group members. So it's impossible to understand ritual without looking through the lens of social group cognition. Richard Sosis and his colleagues have done really fantastically interesting research demonstrating that religious males living in an Israeli kibbutz who engage in public religious rituals are more likely to cooperate in an economic game than secular males. So there's some evidence that these rituals have very, very powerful effects on cooperation. If you aren't familiar with that research, I highly recommend looking out for it. Rituals are also useful to the groups who perform them because they function as mechanisms of social cohesion and foster the longevity of groups. It's actually a very, very relatively new but rapidly growing literature attempting to try to understand what social cohesion is actually about and the role of ritual in that process. So let's turn to the proximate question of mechanism for ritual. Now, as I mentioned in my introduction, the use of rituals for problem-solving or protective purposes is pervasive across populations and over historical time. I've studied these by examining ancient Egyptian text and also sympachias that are widely used in modern-day Brazil. Actually, just as a side anecdote, one of the reasons that I think it's always helpful to attend meetings outside of your own discipline is getting really unexpected insights. So this was probably 3 or 4 years ago, and I was beginning to study sympachias in Brazil and was struck by how deeply unusual they were and how opaque they were from the perspective of physical causality. And having no reference point, I think I overestimated how specific or unusual these were for the Brazilian population. And I went to a religious studies conference and was talking to an Egyptologist who showed these ritualistic remedies that were used in ancient Egypt that looked shockingly similar to sympachias used in modern-day Brazil. And of course, the content of these rituals was slightly different, which reflects what's locally available, of course. But the focus on procedural detail, repetition, specificity gave me insight into how similar these might be, and also the information that might drive the evaluation of ritual efficacy. So attending those conferences, even if it's not immediately clear why they're relevant, can be really scientifically productive. So goal-oriented behavior oriented towards or directed towards avoiding negative and achieving positive outcomes is a big part of how ritual is used. We know that humans are expert intention readers. This is true even from early infancy. And seeing someone engage in a detailed course of ritualistic action gives the impression that features of that action sequence have the potential to produce the intended outcome, even if the underlying mechanisms for the outcome are imperceptible, supernatural, or just simply unknowable. Now, socially transmitted procedures are a characteristic of ritual, and as I mentioned before, at least in terms of the way that I'm studying ritual, individuals do not create their own rituals. And just in case you're thinking that instrumentally oriented ritual is a kind of esoteric practice in ancient Egypt and Brazil, think about simple things that we do all the time that I think are kind of proto-ritualistic. Like how many of you, when you go to an elevator at a conference hotel, press the button to go up multiple times? People do this liars, right? Why would people do this? Right? One press is probably enough. One, because we don't necessarily understand the underlying psychology, the underlying causal mechanism underlying the functioning of elevators. But also, if we only pressed it once, the causal mechanism is unavailable. Maybe we didn't press it hard enough, right? Maybe we didn't get it exactly the right angle. So in an opaque system, repetition is a perfectly rational and reasonable response. So this leads me to what I think of as the ritual paradox. So this is really what got me interested in understanding ritual from a cognitive psychological perspective. Rituals are widely used to treat problems, we've established that, yet there's a lack of a causal mechanism underlying their effects. And critically, this doesn't deter people from doing them. So how do people evaluate the efficacy of ritual in the absence of causal information? And by the way, if you are curious about sympachias, there are many websites dedicated to generating sympachias. This is one of the gurus. And in case academia doesn't work out for me, I have personally been offered a job by this man. Seriously. So I've studied the underlying psychology of ritual experimentally as an experimental psychologist. How could I not? And what I've done is integrate the cognitive anthropological and cognitive psychological approaches to the study of ritual cognition. So rather than evaluate the efficacy of ritual by examining outcomes or experience, my goal here is to examine the kind of information that influences perception of the efficacy of ritual action. So let's go back to that sympachia that I started the talk with. What kind of information could people possibly be using to evaluate ritual efficacy? So I want you to note the procedural detail here. There's a ton of repetition. There's a large number of steps. There's also a lot of information about the items. Why does the paper need to be white and crisp? Why is that relevant? Yet Simbachias are full of information like that. There's specificity about the time, June 12th, the place, the item. Often, for example, there'll be edible items that are used, and it won't just be, say, a mango. It's got to be a specific type of mango from this part of town. They're often digestible, and religious icons often exist. Not always, it's not part of an orthodox religious system, but they are often part of the story here. So what we've done here is my former graduate student, Andre Sosa, and I were fascinated by how to explain why people think these are potentially effective, because we know people think that they are. So keep in mind now that I've kind of presented this information, this gives you the sense that we knew all of this going in, and we in fact did not know this going in. Just as a side note, my background is actually in the development of causal reasoning. So another reason I personally was fascinated by this is this disconnect between how sophisticated our causal reasoning is and our shameless willingness to engage in causally opaque behavior. So we started this project by ordering thousands of copies of Simbachias. So these are widely available in Brazilian supermarkets. So we started out with thousands of these Simbachias. And one of the things that anthropologists have often commented on is if you look at rituals around the globe, they look incredibly diverse. They look like there's absolutely nothing similar underlying them whatsoever. There's tons of different kinds of actions and items and objects they're used for different things. So in going through thousands of these Simbachias, we started to do some pile sorting. Covered the floor of my office with little different piles of things that we thought might matter. And I have a background in biological reasoning, so we thought maybe items that are edible or digestible, maybe that's a big part of how people think they might work. They're often used to treat biological problems. And we generated a list of 9 different kinds of information that we thought might matter. And then we created our own Simbachias. So using content from existing Simbachias, we built Simbachias that were totally indistinguishable from the Simbachias that you would find, except we were able to manipulate particular types of information experimentally. So here's an example of a Simbachia with fewer numbers of steps. Get an orange, squeeze the orange juice out, and following that, bury its flesh. Drink the remaining juice from the orange 3 times a day in the morning, afternoon, and again in the evening. And then we had another experimental condition that had a greater number of steps. So we're comparing these Simbachias, controlling for all information other than, in this particular case, the number of procedural steps. In Brazil, with Brazilian adults, with Brazilian undergraduates, and also because publishing a paper without an American comparison point is almost impossible in experimental psychology for very bad reasons. But anyway, we had an American sample as well. So what we found is that evaluating ritual efficacy is really it's a product of intuitive causal reasoning. I'm not talking about mechanisms here. I'm talking about repetition, number of procedural steps, time specificity. So when that information was included in a Simbachia, and we asked people to evaluate how effective it was at treating any particular problem, these Simbachias were rated as more effective than Simbachias without this information, that didn't specify time, had fewer number of procedural steps, lower levels of repetition. We also found that if a religious icon was present in a Simbachia, that increased perceptions of ritual efficacy. And we've done a whole series of follow-up studies where we primed uncertainty or thinking about lack of control. And we found that that increased the evaluation of ritual efficacy, which is convergent with other evidence within the evolutionary anthropology literature. So let's turn now to proximate questions of ontogeny, which is one of my favorite areas to be. So there's evidence across social scientific disciplines for the function of ritual in social group cognition and behavior, and for the motivational mechanisms underlying ritual participation with adults. Now, the process by which rituals are learned and come to influence, say, group attitudes, has not been studied very extensively within the psychological literature until very recently, although that is changing rapidly. The origins of human social nature and cognition are, of course, found in infancy and in early childhood, placing social cognitive development at the center stage in understanding the evolution of the human mind. So even if you're not interested in children, I still get that question. Oh, are you a developmental psychologist because you like children? Such a bizarre question. I mean, who doesn't like children? But certainly not a reason to have a scientific career. They're actually really relevant to understanding the evolution of the human mind, turns out. So we learn social information from others by imitation. Children readily imitate. They are, I would call them, precocious imitators. Of course, adults can learn this information as well. But why do children imitate? On one hand, this seems like an obvious question, right? They do it to learn information. What I think is really interesting, though, is if you watch a child imitate, it's not readily obvious in many cases